professionalism in medical school admissions is so, so vitally important. And schools are paying attention to that professionalism. Can you talk a little bit about how might the med schools be picking up on this if a student isn't fully engaged in the process, would you say?
Lots of ways. A student is missing emails from the school. They are not keeping their file active by posting new information to their portal if that is allowed. It goes back to my earlier point about attention to detail and really looking at your portal, each school that you have applied to, looking at the portal, knowing what they want, knowing what they don't want. If they don't want to hear from you, then that's the deal. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be annoying. But for the schools that say, we want to hear from you, then you need to be pumping out new information.
This is the Oath podcast presented by MedEdits Medical Admissions. You will learn about all things related to being pre-med, the medical school admissions process, and the residency match. I am your host, Dr. Jessica Freedman.
Hello, everybody, and I want to welcome you to, I think this is the 8th episode of the Oath podcast. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of MedEdits Medical Admissions. I am your host of the Oath podcast. I am a former faculty member, emergency physician. I did a lot of things at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and I founded MedEdits Medical Admissions 18 years ago. And I have with me today Laurie Tansey, and she is one of our senior faculty members. She was one of my original faculty members when MedEdits was continuing to grow, and I needed to bring someone on, and I immediately turned to Laurie, who is a former faculty colleague of mine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and she has experience as well in medical school admissions at both Icahn, at Northwestern, at UCSF, but she has been with us for many, many years. So Laurie, thank you so much for being here today. I think you're all going to love today's topic. And we are talking today about the hidden reasons why applicants don't get into medical school. Now, I think when most people think about, well, why didn't I get into medical school, or why didn't this student get into medical school, they think of the obvious reasons. You know, their MCAT wasn't high enough, their GPA wasn't high enough. Maybe they say, oh, I didn't have enough clinical hours, or I had no research. What we're going to be talking about today are things that are not often discussed, and we are going to be talking about the actual strategic decisions that students make after they submit their medical school application, that if they don't take the right approach, they don't take the right strategy, they may not get into medical school. Every single year, and Laurie, I think that you can attest to this, we work with students who are reapplying to medical school, and they come to us and they say, I don't understand why I didn't get in. I had really amazing stats. I had a 512, 513 or higher on the MCAT. I had a 3.8 or higher on the GPA. I went through and I did everything I was supposed to do as a pre-medical student. I worked with patients. I did research. I did community service. I don't understand why I didn't get into medical school. And when we typically look back and we talk to those students, we can identify why they did not get into medical school, why maybe they did not have a successful cycle. And assuming that the reason isn't obvious, like something like your school list wasn't strategic, or maybe your personal statement wasn't that compelling, or your MCAT score simply wasn't competitive to get into allopathic medical schools, there are sort of hidden reasons or less obvious reasons why you might not have gotten in. And oftentimes that's because when you submitted your application, you stopped growing, you weren't present in the process, you weren't engaged in the process. And that basically meant that you submitted your application and then you were done. So today we're going to be talking about those less talked about reasons why this happens. And for each one, we're going to try to give you some examples. We're going to try to give you some strategies so that if you are applying to medical school, either in this next cycle or maybe in the upcoming cycle, these are things that you can keep in mind to make sure that you don't make these same mistakes. So the first thing we want to talk about is that submitting your application is not the finish line. we think of it as it's the start of the entire application year process. Now, Laurie, can you sort of talk us through with kind of a typical timeline of when students submit their primary application, when they typically get those secondaries done, and then, kind of when interviews typically start, when review of applications happen, and how the student should be, sort of thinking about things when they're kind of going through that application process?
Yes, of course. So it's a marathon, not a sprint, we always say. And put your seatbelt on because you're going to be doing this for a full year. It's such a long process. And I will say it does kind of frustrate me. And I know you and I have talked about this, how they keep adding more steps to the process. Okay, so it is what it is. We're not going to complain on this podcast at this moment. That's not the topic for today. But one of the things it does do is I think it essentially weeds out people who aren't super serious about this and don't really, really want it and aren't super motivated to make this happen, because you got to stay engaged. And so I know that's one of our points today, is to stay engaged. So anyway, timeline. When AMCAS opens, changes from day to day. It's always at the end of May.
It opens early May, but you can't submit till the end of May. So, and that's the key date. That's that date you can hit the submit button, right? Yeah.
Yes. But you do not have to submit on the first day.
Yes.
I know in the pre-med community, this has become a thing.
Yes.
Oh, I'm going to submit the first day. It really, you don't have to.
Right.
You do need to submit in the first couple weeks of the process, ideally. Now, we have other podcasts that talk about when timing doesn't go as planned, and you can do that too, for the most part. But yes, end of May, early June, you want to get that AMCAS submitted so that it can be verified within about a month's time. And at that point, your secondaries will start arriving. Regardless of whether you have an MCAT score or not, most schools are going to send you a secondary, assuming your GPA is competitive. So about 2/3 of schools will automatically send a secondary. Doesn't mean you've met any, certain threshold. About 1/3 of schools will do some cursory review, make sure you've met certain of their important criteria before they send you a secondary. So then our guidance is to complete those secondaries, meaning return them back to the school within 2 to 3 weeks. Now, here's another important piece of advice for this topic today. You have to read instructions. You've got to pay attention to the fine print, to the details of each school. They're all a little bit different. Some schools will say you need to return this within X amount of time. And some schools won't say that. And then again, our guidance is within 2 to 3 weeks of receiving it, you need to send it back. Interviews, I honestly feel like the bulk of the committee's work looking at applications doesn't start until the vast majority, until they've oriented their new class. They have had, a little bit of time for summer vacations, and then they really get started with looking at those new applications. So, some students might hear about an interview in August.
Yeah.
The majority are going to start hearing in September, October, all the way through to February, March.
Right.
So,
right.
I think I hit all the major
absolutely
points.
And I think it's important to realize that there aren't and it's very different than the college process, where there are employees who they are 100% dedicated to the college admissions process. In medical school admissions, there may be one person, like the director of admissions, who that is their only job. But the majority of the people who are reviewing applications at most schools, there are some schools where the director of admissions may review all of the applications. But I'd say the more common model is that different faculty, different people review applications, and they're taking summer vacations. So it's not as if summer is everyone sort of, I think, psychologically takes off a little bit in the summer. So I do agree that that's kind of when things pick up a bit, is in the fall. And so explain to me the student who just stops, the student who says, okay, I have worked so hard. I got a 516 on my MCAT. I have a 3.98 GPA. I've done my research. I have my patient-facing work. I've done a little community service. And, I deserve a break. And so I'm going to submit that application. I know it's awesome. I worked really hard on my documents, and I just kind of want to relax. I want to work on my secondaries. I want to just do whatever activity I had planned for the summer. But, it's okay for me to kick back. So tell me kind of what that stopping an all of your activities or a lot of your activities or not continuing to engage in activities. What does that look like? And what are the potential pitfalls of doing that?
So if you have a stellar application, it certainly buys you some latitude in terms of this, these next, months. On the other hand, I think a great applicant is internally motivated, is altruistic, wants to be around people, wants to be helping, wants to be learning, wants to be doing, whatever it is they want to be doing that they've decided how to stay engaged during their gap year. They're doing that. So we're not saying you have to do that, 80 hours a week for the whole gap year. You can take a summer vacation and, take some other vacation, and you should, but you do need to be productive. That's my word. So when you go to your interviews, you need to have things to talk about. You need to have new things to talk about, new stories, new anecdotes. The other thing is that, the update letter has really become, I would say, part of this admissions process, even though it's not an official part. I guess they kind of formalized it, letters of interest and letters of intent. They are mentioned now in each school's MSAR profile. Schools will say whether they accept these letters of interest, which are also kind of update letters in our minds, and letters of intent, which are more a declaration. We can get into that.
Yeah.
So you need new things to talk about, and you need to realize that you're probably going to have to send some update letters to nudge things along,
right? To
let schools know. It's like a signal. I'm still here. I'm still interested.
Right.
So I guess that's sort of my response.
Yeah. And, and so you bring up, some great points here, and committees want to see that you are fully engaged, right? So when you go on an interview, and let's say, because as Laurie said, most interviews aren't going to really start in full force until September. We certainly see, applicants interviewing very heavily into January, February. So think of your application as it's a snapshot in time. So when you get to an interview in January, if you haven't developed in any way, what are you going to talk about on that interview? You're going to talk about stuff that you could talk about 6 months ago. What else do you have to layer onto that? When people are in their, early 20s, 6 months is a long time, and you mature a lot during that time. So they want to see that evolution and that development. And if you have nothing that's to sort of update them on your interviews, or let's say you were a really great applicant, you submitted really early, and you got early interviews, but let's say you haven't heard from the school, or maybe the school is releasing all of their acceptances in March, and you need to update that school. What are you going to tell them? And I'd like to sort of go through a couple of, case examples, and obviously the names are changed here for privacy reasons. But these are based on real students. And so I think you're going to find this helpful. So applicant A submits her primary application in early June, right? So within the first week of AMCAS opening, she's been working as a medical assistant for about a year. Her secondaries go in. She pre-wrote some of those. So, she got those in pretty early. And by November, she has taken on new roles. She's now training new medical assistants. She is teaching people how to do EKGs. She's also started working with an outreach type of program for the clinic, where she is helping to do patient education. And in December, she sends a brief update letter to her top choice schools, all the schools where she's gotten interviews, as well as those where she hasn't gotten interviews, and accept letters. And she has updated them on everything that she's been doing since she submitted her application. She got into 80% of the schools where she interviewed. Okay. She demonstrated growth. She demonstrated evolution. She demonstrated that she was fully invested. Okay, now let's look at applicant B. Applicant B, stellar applicant, 517 MCAT, over a 3.9 GPA, submits the application in June, has a great timeline, is a senior in college and plans to graduate in December. He feels like he's like, look, I got some early interviews, right? Because he got a couple interviews in, let's say, October, November. And that makes him feel really confident. He knows he's strong on paper. He knows he can get those interviews. And he's a little overconfident. So he feels like, look, I'm graduating. I've worked really hard in 3.5 years to get all this done. And that is a tremendous accomplishment to be able to get everything done as a traditional applicant applying at the end of junior year. And he almost stops all of his activities, right? So he's graduated and all he's doing is working as a tutor, not engaging in anything new, not bringing any of those previous activities to the new level, no new accomplishments. He ends up waitlisted at all those schools where he's interviewed. And then when he wants to try to push the needle to try to get off those wait lists, he has nothing to push the needle with. He has no new letters of recommendation. He has no new activities. He has no new accomplishments. And he ends up having to reapply. When he works with us on his reapplication, we give him guidance on the additional experiences he needs to engage in. We really try to get him to demonstrate that authenticity. And this is someone who knew from a very young age that he wanted to be a physician. It wasn't that the motivation wasn't there, but it didn't show up on his application, didn't show up in his writing. And on the reapplication, he gets into a top 25 medical school. So, I think the big take home here, if you're listening and you're applying, let's say next year, or you're applying in the coming cycle, is you need to ask yourself, what am I going to look like when I submit my application? And what am I going to look like 6, 7, 8 months later when I need to demonstrate growth? And you never want the answer to be, I'm going to look exactly the same. You want to make sure that you've done something. This doesn't mean that you need to do anything earth-shattering or that you need to engage in 20 new activities. It could just mean building on what you've been doing, but you want there to be some type of growth and some type of accomplishment that you can demonstrate over that period of time.
Yes, absolutely. I do feel like being a reapplicant is honestly not a bad thing. It's not, you're not perceived as sort of damaged goods, since they weren't successful, they must not going to be successful. It's really almost the opposite. It's like, okay, they are picking themselves back up. They are analyzing what happened. They are putting forth another applicant. They must be very determined. They must really want this. I think the vast majority of the time, that's sort of the sentiment. I do think it can be really tough to pick yourself back up, though, from a failed cycle. So that kind of leads me to a point about, when to apply, timing. It's such an important decision. You cannot rush this. You really only want to do it once and do it ideally right, do everything right. So just wanted to plug that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Interestingly, and we have so many tidbits here where we could sort of give these nuggets of information to just sort of inspire. That student that I talked about got into a top 25 medical school. He had interviewed at that medical school the previous cycle.
Great, yeah.
So you have to have faith and you have to keep going. And honestly, I think that in and of itself, as a reapplicant, if you're somebody who's reapplying, you're demonstrating that commitment. You're demonstrating like, this is really what I want to do. And then as long as you show, in your application, what additional things you've taken on in order to improve your candidacy, over the period of that time, then that's going to help you to be successful in that reapplication cycle, because, reapplying it's a lot of work. So you do have to be very, very committed in order to reapply.
Right. And this is a little bit of a rare situation, but I think it's worth mentioning. If you don't get into the school you wanted to get into, you're not that is not a situation where you should reapply and expect a different outcome.
Yeah.
Reapplication is only for people who have no know where to go.
Yeah.
Did not get in.
Right.
I think that's really an important point.
Yes.
This is unfortunately not an applicant preferred.
Yes, we've talked about
situation.
that a lot. Yeah.
This is you go enthusiastically to the school that accepts you.
Any med school, any U.S. allopathic med school is a great med school, and we say that a lot. So yes, just be grateful for whatever acceptances you get. Please, every once in a while we will get people saying, well, this really wasn't my top choice, and so I'm kind of thinking about, should I just turn down the acceptance and reapply next year? And that is so risky. I mean, have we had people who've done this who've been successful? Yes, but is never something that we recommend. Never. So when you are, completing your school list, you need to look at that school list and say, if I get accepted here, am I willing to go here? Mm-hmm.
I think honestly, that whole notion of a top choice, that needs to be left with the college process. Yes. That is not something you can carry into the medical school admissions process.
Yeah.
It's not like that.
It's not like that. It's the very rare person who can say, this is my dream school. And if I get, and I got in there. I mean, in one of our previous episodes, we did, profile a student who did get into her dream school, mm-hmm. but that is not the typical thing. That is not typical.
Right. And interestingly, what students realize as they go through this year-long process, they are often surprised by the schools that they learn about.
Yes.
And they get very excited about schools they had no idea anything about. And so that's always great to see too.
Yeah. So the second thing that we want to talk about today that can really lead to a lack of success in the medical school admissions process, and I do think that we see this every year, Laurie, is a lack of engagement in the process. And we can sometimes see that as we work with students, and this shows up in a variety of ways. And sometimes students may not even realize this is happening. But when we see these different signs, we definitely see it as somewhat ominous. And this is when students stop writing to us. They stop sending us updates. We reach out to them and they stop replying to our messages. They don't keep us posted on any developments. And literally they become MIA in our book. They're missing in action. We don't know what's going on with them. And regardless of how much we reach out to them, they don't write back to us, or maybe they write back to us very, very sporadically. So when we see this, we know that the cycle is not going to go as well as maybe they wanted it to, or maybe even as well as we anticipated it was going to go. Because when you are applying to medical school, you have to be fully engaged in the process. And that means that you need to always be paying attention to your portals. You always need to be updating your medical schools, as we discussed earlier, if they allow updates. And this is because professionalism in medical school admissions is so vitally important. So, and schools are paying attention to that professionalism, right, Laurie? So can you talk a little bit about, we see this behind the scenes, right? And so when we see this behind the scenes, we know that the medical schools are most likely picking up on this as well, right? How might the med schools be picking up on this if a student isn't fully engaged in the process, would you say?
Lots of ways. A student is missing emails from the school. They are not keeping their file active by posting new information to their portal, if that is allowed. It goes back to my earlier point about attention to detail and really looking at your portal, each school that you have applied to, looking at the portal, knowing what they want, knowing what they don't want. If they don't want to hear from you, then that's the deal. And you don't want to be annoying. But for the schools that say, we want to hear from you, then you need to be pumping out new information. So also, if you are put on a wait list, you need to enthusiastically accept that wait list. Any opportunity to reply to a message or to fill out a new piece of information. And this is one thing that we've been noticing in recent years is schools are trying to gauge how interested people on their wait list are. So they'll send you a little, quick couple of questions to
Yes.
answer.
Yes.
So you have got to stay enthusiastically engaged, gratefully engaged, because it's an opportunity, and people get off the wait list. You know, again, this is not like college admissions. This is a much different situation. Using, resources, if you have a pre-med advisor, if you have alums, if you have friends who go to this particular medical school that you can be talking to, learning more about the school so that informs your letters of interest or update letters that you're sending to the schools. So there's just lots of ways to be, engaging with the process.
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point. And I think it's really only been in the past like year or two, I think 2 years, where we've really seen that medical schools want to hear from applicants, and they're very forthcoming about it. And you brought this up with regards to the MSAR. So the MSAR is the Medical School Admissions Requirements Database. We will link that in the show notes. And I think it was only last year, I think it was the last cycle, that they started including information about if schools accept letters of interest, which are letters that express your interest in a school, versus a letter of intent, which is a letter that says, if I'm accepted, I will attend your school, just to give those definitions. And so right away, that's sending the message that, look, these schools want communication from you. And so how does it look, let's say, if a school gets 2 to 3 updates from a student that are all very meaty, that are all very significant, and that person's on a wait list, you're also on the wait list, and you send nothing. Or maybe you send one update, but it really doesn't have any really great information in it, So it kind of becomes this waitlist competition is kind of how I'm envisioning it at this point. And again, you don't want those updates to lack sincerity. You don't want to bombard them. Some of the medical schools are going to limit the number of updates you can send. So you want to send them strategically. So you don't want to just be sending updates just for the heck of it. Like, okay, I'm going to send 20 updates and that's going to show that I'm the most interested student. They need to be quality updates. So I do think this really, as I'm thinking it through, just thinking about this, like, if you're on the other side of this and you're looking at a portal and you're looking at one student's portal and let's say it's, May 15th and you're looking to who to take off the wait list, and that student's been sending you really great updates ever since they interviewed in January, versus a student who, let's say, interviewed in October, got waitlisted, and maybe they've sent one very mediocre update, So I think that's actually kind of an interesting thing to think about, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, they would assume that the second student you were talking about probably is going somewhere else. And so then at that point, they might reach out and try to ascertain, are you interested in even staying on our wait list?
Yes.
I think, students, like you were mentioning, have to stay engaged. But there's also, you don't want to look like a crazy person.
Yes.
So
there's a balance. It's a balance.
This is all very nuanced, and you don't want to be, sending them a message once a week because that's right. So the timing of that can all be discussed, but certainly more sincere and meaningful.
Yes.
A few communications would be the preference. And then I think, the other thing we have to acknowledge is that there are plenty of things that are just beyond the scope of a student's control.
Yep.
There is the notion that a school is trying to balance their class when it comes to this point of admitting people from the wait list. And you just might not be the person that they need to balance their class.
Right.
So there's, again, certain things you just cannot control. I think there are certain states where this becomes tough. As we've talked about, it's tough for Californians. It can be tough too when there's a little bit of a mismatch maybe between the state you grew up in, but then you went off to college at a really, prestigious college. And so you don't really want to go to your state school, even though it's a great school in our opinion. And you're kind of looking for something different. So those kinds of things can become a little tricky too, where there's kind of that mismatch.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry, I think I got off on a few tangents there.
Yeah, no, all good, all good. No, these are all good points. Okay, now we're going to talk about point number 3. And that has to do with not being assertive with waitlists. So let's first, I know we've, kind of touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about how waitlists actually work. And we see waitlists, especially for medical schools that allow you to send communications, which is the majority, right? I think it's the minority of schools that don't allow communications, but we see those as opportunities if the schools allow you to send updates, if they allow you to send letters of intent. So first, understand how waitlists function. The majority of waitlists, once you are waitlisted, that doesn't mean you're on continued review. Continued review is a whole other bucket, which means that you're being visited periodically throughout the cycle. But a waitlist typically means that that pool of students are not going to be looked at until the commit-to-enroll date, when students are only allowed to hold one acceptance. Again, this is for allopathic schools, and that's on May 1st. And then at that point, once the medical schools know what their full complement is, how many students they have who've committed to their class, they are then going to start to fill that class through their waitlist. So at that stage, they start to go back to all of their waitlisted students, and they're looking at that point, what differentiates those applicants who are on that waitlist? Now, remember, you probably submitted your application nearly a year ago, right? So you probably submitted your application. You probably worked on it at the beginning of May. So we are talking a full year. That's a lot of time. So again, going back to our first point, if you haven't demonstrated growth and development and progress and meaningful impact in that period of time, the medical school admissions committees are most likely going to be choosing someone who wants to go to their school who has demonstrated all of that. So this is why communicating to medical schools, you are my first choice and I will attend if accepted for these reasons, is very, very important. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Laurie, what are some of the common waitlist mistakes that students make? And I think we have touched on some of these already, so we probably don't need to spend a ton of time on this. But let's just kind of, go through, I think, like the biggest mistakes that students make when they're on waitlists that don't allow those waitlists to convert to acceptances.
Yeah, sure. And you're right. We have touched upon this, so I'll be brief. The first is just responding to your messages when they reach out to you. They're trying to see how interested you are. So respond quickly, respond gratefully, respond enthusiastically. If they're asking you to send new information, do that. Follow their instructions. Send them an update if you haven't about what you've been doing, and let them know why you want to attend their school. Now, having had several months to learn more about this process, about how medical education is run at different schools, why this school is the best place for you. The letter of intent, should we talk about that?
We can talk about that. Yes, and we can talk about the general outline that we like for a letter of intent. Absolutely, but yeah.
Because I think this really is back to that control and what the students can control. This is really the main thing.
Yep.
If you're on a wait list and you want to go to that school, and you're willing to say to them, I will attend if you accept me, I will withdraw my other acceptances, or I will withdraw my other wait lists. It helps them if they have, if it's important to them to have a high yield and to be able to say a certain percentage of our students accepted our offer. So yeah, that's the letter of intent. It's very similar to a letter of continued interest, but it's with some added language that you will attend if accepted. And This is not really a binding agreement. However, in our minds, it is. This is a profession that people have to be able to trust what their colleagues are saying. And if you tell them you're going to do something, you better do it. So if you say you're going to attend if accepted, in our minds, you have to do that. So you can't be sending letters of intent to multiple schools if you send a letter of intent and that school then rejects you, well, then you can go on to the next school on your list and say, I want to come to you and I will attend if accepted. So that's,
yeah. So just a general outline for letter of intent, just because I know this is so important to people. So initial opening, general, I want to express my strong interest, and I want to let you know that if I'm accepted to your school, I'll attend. Then the key thing are specifics. And we're always, when we're editing these letters with our students, we're always saying, okay, where are the specifics? What are the specific reasons you want to attend? What are the specific things that you have done? What specific updates do you have? And, you want to focus on, obviously, whatever achievements you've had. That's based on you. But then with regards to the school, what opportunities exist there? What do you appreciate about the curriculum? What do you appreciate about the clinical rotations? So we're always trying to get our students to include as many specifics in that letter of intent to really show that they understand the medical school and that they appreciate the medical school. And then, of course, you always want to close with gratitude and another sort of reiteration of, I want to go to your school. If I'm in, I'm going. And so that's kind of the general letter. And Laurie, you also touched on this before, but like one of the mistakes you can make in communicating with medical schools is just sending, just pounding them with lots and lots of, of emails and communications. And that can then seem a little bit desperate. So there, and then they start to think, I don't think we want this student. They don't understand limits, because again, all of this comes back to professionalism. However you behave in the medical school admissions process is how you are going to behave as a medical student, as a resident, as an attending. And as we talk about the AMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, pre-med core competencies that they're looking for in students, and I can link those in the show notes as well. You're being assessed for this, not only in your application, not only during your interview, but through your communications with them. And Laurie and I, we talk about this on every episode. We're assessing those things as well. And so, all of this, kind of goes back to how are you demonstrating those core competencies that they really want to see in their applicants.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about the fourth reason why students often aren't accepted to medical school, and that's getting distracted by high stats, high metrics, high MCAT, high GPA. And the reality is, look, GPA and MCAT matter, and there is no denying that. But sometimes when students have very high metrics, they have a really impressive MCAT score, sometimes they can be distracted by that MCAT score, saying to themselves, oh my gosh, look, I've got a 519 on the MCAT. Of course, I'm getting into med school. Like, I'm in the top percentile. They're going to take me. But not only do the students themselves kind of get distracted by those high metrics, but sometimes the advisors do too. So we'll work with students, for example, who, let's say they have a 519 MCAT, they have a 3.9 GPA. They've sort of, gone through and they've engaged in activities the way they're supposed to, maybe nothing exceptional, but they've been involved, and their advisor at their college will say to them, look, students with your MCAT, we've never had a student with your MCAT not get into medical school. And so they kind of go into the process feeling overly confident. And we see that both in terms of being overly confident on the student side, and we see that being overly confident on the advisor side too. And so, it's really important to sort of not get distracted by those metrics, because the metrics get you to the gate, they get you to the door, but that isn't what gets you in. So what are your thoughts about that, Laurie?
So this is such an important point, because I think the high GPA and high MCAT really can speak to a student who's a great student, or someone who studies a lot, who has really perfected, the art of getting good grades or being able to sit and focus and do well on a test. I mean, it's very hard to do well on the MCAT. So I don't mean to diminish that at all in any way. But I think those are also external motivators to an extent. For the high achieving student, that's just what they're going to do. It's almost like they've been programmed and they need to see those numbers for self-worth. So then I think what admissions committees are looking for, I mean, obviously, it'd be great to have everything in an applicant, but you're trying to find the student who's internally motivated, who's the person who does the right thing, who has exceptional character, who has incredible sense of responsibility and altruism and morals and ethics and all of that. So that doesn't always couple with the most high achieving students. So that's why the experiences and getting out of your dorm room and going out into the world and doing all these different things and then being able to talk about those becomes so critically important. And I think that's also why we've seen this, rise in the gap year is admissions committees almost want them to have that time and that maturation.
Yeah.
And to do those things. So if you are a student with high stats and you're using your gap year to kind of fill in for some of those experiences, the update letter that we've been referring to throughout the podcast becomes really important because you need to tell them what you're seeing and what you're observing and what you're noticing and what you're learning about what it is to sit with a dying patient or what it is for a patient to hear bad news and to absorb that with a patient. And so I think that sort of distills down why high stats alone will not get you into medical school.
Yeah. And sometimes what we see is, again, look, the MCAT is, it's a killer test, and so sometimes, we'll see students who, let's say they get a really high MCAT and they were aiming high, but they get a 519 and they're like, oh my gosh, now I can get into every top medical school in the country. And so they assume that. And so then what do? They apply only to top tier schools. And, and then when we look at the application and we're doing a reapplication analysis, which we are, often do when students don't get in, they contact us and we'll look and we'll say, yeah, your metrics are absolutely phenomenal. And your metrics definitely make you competitive for these schools, but your experiences are not in those range. So when we're making school lists for students, we're not only looking at their metrics, we're looking at are the experiences in the range for those schools. And because we've been working with students for so long and we understand what different students' experiences look like at different medical schools, we understand what, how in depth those experiences need to be in order, to be competitive. And then, of course, it's all about how you express yourself. So usually a student who is going to have more in-depth experiences is going to be able to write more impactful documents versus a student who maybe has been more superficially involved or has had, maybe a lot of involvement in one experience only and not many things. They're probably just not going to be able to write documents that are as compelling and, as sort of inspiring as the student who's been engaged in experiences that are really, really meaningful over time. Right?
Right. It's a very humbling process and you cannot... It always concerns me, the student who says, well, I want to go to a top tier school.
Yeah.
And, don't open with that.
Right.
Open with, I want to be a doctor.
Yep.
And, we always recommend a very well-stratified list.
Yeah.
Because again, back to this notion of there are so many things beyond your control, including just kind of some bad luck in terms of who might be reading your application or who might be interviewing you and what kind of day they're having.
Yeah.
So you really need to have lots of opportunities in lots of, sort of different varying, types of schools.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Let me just do like a quick, very, case study. And this is obviously, names are changed, all these details are changed, the specifics. But this student had a 518 MCAT, 3.9 GPA, biochem major. So looked really solid on paper with regards to his stats, okay? Was a medical assistant. By the time they applied, they had, I think, 1,000 hours, and then they were going to have 1,000 projected hours as a medical assistant by the time they would have started medical school. Very, very light on service, had I think 30 to 40 hours of community service, nothing longitudinal, had one very superficial research experience, maybe 60 to 70 hours in, I think, the sophomore or junior year, submitted a broad school list and wrote strong documents that were based on the experience the student had. And our guidance was, we feel you're competitive for osteopathic medical schools. We realize your metrics are solid, but your experience profile speaks more to an osteopathic medical school applicant than an allopathic medical school applicant. Student was not interested in that, applied, got one very early allopathic interview, and it was a state school, ended up getting waitlisted at that medical school, and ultimately did not get in because the student had no updates, despite us explaining, you need more community service, you need to get more engaged in these experiences, but they thought that their metrics would get them in, right? Reapplied, embraced all of our suggestions, got into allopathic medical schools, right? So you really have to be careful of being distracted by those high numbers. Again, it's really impressive, but it's not what gets you in. It's the experiences that actually get you in.
Yes, totally agree.
Okay, Laurie, now let's talk about the fifth reason why students often aren't accepted to medical school, and that's not addressing experience gaps during the cycle. And when we are meeting with students, when we are going into an application cycle, we are assessing where they potentially can continue to improve their candidacy, where they potentially have gaps in their candidacy. And we're making those recommendations because, as we've been talking about throughout this entire podcast, we understand how important it is to be sending those updates and to be basically impressing medical schools throughout the application cycle. So, and fill in if you think there are any I'm missing here, but I think the most common experience gaps that we see are lack of meaningful community service, especially working with underserved communities, really engaging with communities and understanding those communities. Limited patient-facing experience does not need to be paid clinical work. I honestly think there's too much emphasis right now on paid clinical work. We're talking about patient-facing experience where you're understanding the patient experience. Few long-term commitments where you're really demonstrating impact. I think that sometimes can be an issue. Or no real world experience where you've actually been out in the real world, where you've actually had a job. And then, of course, there are going to be the academic reasons why students don't get in, either, low MCAT score or maybe a downward GPA trend, not fixing that GPA trend. I think those are the major reasons why students don't get in. Obviously, academic concerns would be the only gap that we might recommend a student take a gap year for. That is, in my opinion, not something that you fix during an application year. But all of the experience-related gaps, I think, can be addressed during the application year. Would you agree, Laurie?
I do agree, although some students might do a special master's program or a do-it-yourself type of, additional coursework during their gap year. And so you could certainly be sending out your grades if that's the case for you and you're in something like that. I don't think, like a master's in public health, I'm not sure that's really going to address any academic concerns, to be honest. There are certain master's programs that might address academic concerns, and then there are some that just don't, because everybody knows it's easy to get good grades.
Right, exactly.
In some of these master's programs, and then, you're spending a lot to be in them.
Yes.
It's kind of a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But yes, I do agree that you can fill in some of these gaps, but you also don't want it to look sort of disingenuous either.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it needs to kind of dovetail with things you've already done, or where you think your career is headed, how you're spending this gap year and this time, and then telling them about it, turning around and telling them about it after a few solid months of actual experience. Don't send them a letter after 2 weeks. But give it some time.
Right.
But no, absolutely, you can fill some of those gaps in during your application cycle.
Yeah, and again, because if you think about it, when you submit the application versus when you're going to potentially be negotiating waitlist, that's a full year. It's a lot of time to get.
It is a lot of
time. Get some really significant involvements in, and to really make a difference and make an impact. So that's kind of how you need to be thinking about it. So I realize some of you listening are perhaps going to be reapplicants, or maybe you're worried you're going to be a reapplicant. So, I think that the key thing is that students need to always be improving their profile. So as a pre-med student, during your application year, you always need to be in, kind of like growth and development and improvement mode, right? You never want to be fixed in time. And, so I think that's probably the biggest takeaway today. Would you say?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree. And again, just a message of optimism. Reapplication is not a deal breaker. You can do well as a reapplicant. We can absolutely help you in terms of how to kind of think about telling your story in a different way, or maybe you didn't quite get the story down the first time. So yeah, we can totally help with that.
And if you are applying to medical school in the coming cycles, if you're a pre-med student thinking about applying to medical school anytime, or if you are in the current application cycle and you need help getting off a wait list, feel free to contact us. We help with students with every aspect of the medical school admissions process, and we have been doing so for 18 years. So Laurie, I think that was a very helpful session and or podcast. And I think it's going to offer I hope it's going to offer a lot of great information for students, and hopefully do a little bit of damage control, especially for those students who are thinking about applying and haven't applied yet. So thank you so much for your time, Laurie. Thank you for being here. I encourage you all to subscribe to our podcast and to visit our website at www.mededits.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.